The War in Ukraine and the Eurasian Worldorder, written by Glenn Diesen. It's a historical book from the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 to the Ukrainian War, and it gives a concept for the creation of a new multipolar world order. Professor Glenn Diesen is a Norwegian scholar specialized on the subject. His book got fantastic critics from prominent international scholars like John Mearsheimer and Jeffrey Sachs. He presented in January 2022 as well, a big study, Russophobia. Welcome at Alternatief TV. We ask where the mainstream media is silent. I'm Ab Gietelink, today in dialogue with Mr. Glenn Diesen. Welcome in the program, Glenn.
Oh, thank you so much. It's great to finally speak with you.
Well, first the question, maybe you can introduce something about your background. What is your background?
Well, I'm, as you mentioned, a Norwegian scholar, but I lived abroad for about 20 years. Most of those 14 years in Australia, but I also did part of my PhD actually in Netherlands, but also
Oh
I
yeah?
worked
Where?
um, uh, Amsterdam Vrije in Amsterdam South.
Right.
I'm actually a Dutch citizen as well, because my mother's side of the family are Dutch, so most of my family are actually from Roosendaal in the south. So
Okay.
I'm yeah, but yeah, so but I was working at university teaching in Australia until about 2017, and then I moved to Moscow, where I worked as professor at the Higher School of Economics, an institution that focused largely on Eurasian integration. And then, for the past 4 years, I've been working here in Norway.
Yeah. You wrote, I find out, a book, Russophobia. Uh, you just published it before the Russian invasion in Ukraine. Can you tell us something about it? We're not going to have a big discussion because we're going to have a discussion about your new book, but
Yeah.
something about this old book.
Yeah, well, it was an unfortunate time for it to come out. It was my ninth or tenth book, and it came out in January of 2022, so right before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I feel instead of giving reviews of the book, I spent most of my time explaining that Russophobia meant irrational fear and hatred of Russia. So there are good reasons, or you have rational reasons to fear Russia, like there's rational reasons to fear any country in the world. But I made the point that this is based on Russophobia is the product is the result of propaganda, because propaganda is also falls within the social sciences of how you convince an audience without appealing to reason. So it's the tactics where you exploit the non-rational aspects of human being, because we are group animals. A lot of the things we do is still based on instincts. So it's a way of exploiting the way human beings learn, but also how they adjust to the perceptions of the group, how you exploit us versus them, which is very deeply built into the mentality. So it's it was a very rewarding book to
Well, what
write.
is what is in fact your exact profession? Because this is a kind of mass of psychological, social, and I got the impression you have historical background as well. Is that right?
Yeah, well, a lot of this is history as well, because if you don't look at where propaganda originates, it does most of the literature actually came out ahead of the and before and after the First World War, and again, a lot of this would be one of the main propagandists who worked for the U.S. government was Edward Bernays. Again, his father was Freud, Sigmund Freud, and he had kind of built on the same
Right.
idea that the group psychology is very irrational and it overrides individual reasoning. And so he looked at how this can be exploited. So a lot of this has a historical topic to it as well, but it does fall within international relations. So, but yeah,
Okay, then we're gonna start on the book. It is translated by Nico Noord. It's from the Blauwe Tijger here in Groningen. I mean the translation, and but of course the original was in English and in Norwegian maybe.
No, not Norwegian.
No,
No.
in English. Um, let's start with the. I mean I read it. It's interesting. 1648. The concept of the Treaty of Westphalia. It's the end of the 30 World War, and you call that the beginning of modern history. First of all, what is the treaty and the concept of that Westphalian world order, which is important to understand the war in Ukraine?
Well, I point out that the Peace of Westphalia is the origin of the modern world order because, as we noticed throughout the 30-year war between the European powers, which was extremely destructive between 1618 and 1648, we saw that none of the major European powers were able to actually defeat all the others and restore a hegemon that is you restore a Roman Empire, so an international system or European system based on only one center of power. It wasn't possible to achieve, and this was the main discovery as well. That even because a lot of this was also not just a dispersal of power, so many centers of power competing against each other, but the values and foundation or legitimacy for sovereignty as well had been fragmented with the Reformation. So you had Catholics versus Protestants, and the idea was that each religion would be united. But again, we saw that the French were willing to ally with the Swedes in order to balance Habsburg. So every time one dominant power seemed like it could win, others would balance it. So after 30 years of killing each other and no prospect of establishing one victor, we established the Peace of Westphalia, which meant that we divided and delineated the sovereignty under the princes, which is later the states, and each and the way peace is maintained is not to have one center of power, it's for the different centers of powers to balance each other. And also with this comes the recognition of security competition. That is, if one state wants to have security, you also have to make sure that your opponents feel secure as well. If you increase your security at the expense of their security, they will likely respond in an unfavorable way. So this has been more or less the world order we've had over the centuries since. Of course, you had people like Napoleon, Hitler trying to overthrow this and establish a system, a new hegemon, but it was always balanced. But now, after the Cold War, we saw a fundamental challenge to that world order, which was because during the Cold War you had two centers of power. Towards the end of the Cold War, the Soviet Union collapses. Now there's only one center of power left, which is the United States. And this is when they had the question they had to answer is what kind of international system did they want to establish after the Cold War? Do they have a multipolar system based on the UN Charter, or do they pursue a unipolar system, a new hegemon, a new Roman Empire?
Yeah, to go back, we're gonna talk more about that, but to go back to the Treaty of Westphalia. Maybe for the audience, it's nice. Westphalia is just over the Dutch border. In fact, there are two cities: the city of Münster and the city of Osnabrück. It's about 40 kilometers from the border. Let's say near Enschede. But the point is, the point is what I missed a bit in your book, and you told me now that you are even a background in Dutch. You know, 1648 is a very important date in the Dutch history. The concept. It's not only the 30 years war, it's as well the end of the 80 years war in the Netherlands and the recognition from the Republic of the United Netherlands. What? Why didn't you? Well, I'm not sure if you didn't even mention it, but you don't make it to an important thing in your book. This Dutch dimension in the Treaty of Westphalia.
No, that's fair enough. That could have gotten a larger space or any space for that sake. But again, in some areas, because it's a very wide topic, yeah, there has to be some cutouts, I guess. But the main way I defined world order is based on two things. One is the distribution of power, that is how many centers of power, and the second is the legitimacy. So that's kind of how I assessed the key foundations of Westphalian order, because again, in under yeah, like Holy Roman Empire, you have one center of power based on one faith, so one source of legitimacy to rule of other peoples. In a Westphalian system, my whole point was that you have many centers of power, and no longer do you have one common church, which has then the essentially the right to rule or represent other people. So this kind of laid the values for, well, which supported the principle of sovereignty, that yeah, that each prince should be able to choose their own religion, etc. So I guess this is the main reason I focused only on these two variables.
Right, right. I like to go with you because I first thought when I got the book that you would write an historical thing, and I missed this a bit because I'm very much an historical center. But I like to give you some comment on that. This Westphalian order stayed, in fact, till the Napoleonic times. That's 1789 to 1815. You don't mention that, but then the next is, in fact, what you call the Concert of Vienna in 1815. How do you consider this transition period, this Napoleonic period in your theory?
In terms of how world order was shifted.
Right, right. As a world order, as a possibility to create a new world order, because Napoleon said as well that there was a kind of balance of power between, let's say, the continental powers against the British.
Yeah. No, exactly. And that's also how they wanted to challenge the competitive advantage of the British, which is this Napoleonic continental system where you cut off trades with the British as a way of eliminating its competitive advantage. Now, I indeed even draw parallels to this as what I refer to the Eurasian world order, because if you differentiate between maritime hegemons and continental land powers, this is one way you do it. The land powers comes together in order to decouple from the maritime hegemon. Now, but of course, under Napoleon, you had the same ideas. You have this, yeah, even some of the first time, this idea of a yeah, United States of Europe almost pops up as a concept. So unifying like one center of power in Europe. It's also under after French Revolution, it's also more built now on liberal ideals as well. So this is something not just after French Revolution, but I point out that you actually have it after the Bolshevik as well, which is after the French Revolution, yeah, after claiming the Brotherhood of Nations, etc., etc. Right. They move on to suggest that the French will will come to the assistance of other peoples also seeking their liberty. So suddenly, under this universal principles or universal ideals, claiming the right to again support, represent other peoples. So I see the Napoleonic era as a key challenge to the Westphalian world order. Right. But also when this comes to an end, the Napoleonic order, we have the Concert of Europe, in which it's very much based on Westphalia. That is, even the defeated part, which would be the French, gets a seat at the table in this new European order, and
that's the Concert of Vienna in 1815, right?
That's correct.
Right, right.
And this is when also I would define this as a very conservative Westphalian project overall, where the sovereignty of the nations or of the states is now well effectively restored again or attempted to
Yeah. Well, then we come in a let's say next phase, which is in fact the 19th century between 1815 and 1914, at the beginning of the First World War. We call it the liberal era. And I was mentioned by a thing which intrigued me, what you call, let's say the autocratic liberalism, because this kind of idea that liberalism can have a kind of progressive side, but it can have an autocratic side as well. And one of your critics in the modern time, I understand, is that liberalism showed more autocratic aspects of its being. Is that right?
It's you're referring to the relationship between liberalism and, for example, democracy and
Yeah, right.
progress.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, we saw that these days we often take it as granted that liberalism, democracy, they're two sides of the same coin, but we see that in Britain during the Victorian era, you have John Stuart Mill, who's again a champion of liberalism,
Yeah.
and he's quite open in his assessment that liberalism is a good way of putting the individual at the center and essentially transitioning from this very tradition-based society in which they had in England. Now, to this end, it's positive with democracy then, as long as the people want it. And this is, by the way, something we saw during the period of globalization in the 19th century as well. The problem is, as John Stuart Mill pointed out, what happens at the end when globalization kind of comes to an end, it dies out. Because he pointed out the masses, in his opinion, wouldn't always be smart enough to continue the liberal project. Indeed, there's a tendency, indeed, in human nature to withdraw into collective identities, nationalism for one, and culture, tradition, something organized around group identities. So this is at this point he actually saw it as being more beneficial to have some liberal elites which would rule over the uninformed masses, which is something we seem to be experiencing today as well.
Right. I want to make a new step. We're going to the First World War, 1418, and then, of course, the Treaty of Versailles. You didn't say a lot of things about that, but how do you consider when you compare the concept of Europe in 1815 and the Treaty of Versailles in 1919? What went wrong in the Treaty of Versailles?
Well, after the concept of Europe, it responded in the Westphalian world order. That is, France is beaten, but instead of perpetuating the weakness of France,
Right.
because peace isn't created by one side being able to defeat the other and trying to keep them weak. No,
Right.
on the contrary, you have to bring them back in, also take their security into account. This is the core. This was done with the French after the Napoleonic Wars. Now, what happened with the Treaty of Versailles was very different. The Germans were defeated, and this treaty was designed to effectively perpetuate the weakness of Germany. So, they were defeated. Peace would depend on keeping them weak. And obviously, this meant little to no security for Germany, humiliation, and this also, I think, was a large extent a product of propaganda. As this is something we discussed early on. If you portray your adversaries, as the Wilson administration did quite well, as being evil and you're good, under such war propaganda, it's not good for the Westphalian system, because if you're good fighting evil, then peace is created by destroying your adversaries, not finding compromise and taking into account their security concerns. So obviously, I think this heavy propaganda coming out of the Wilson administration also contributed to a large extent to have a extreme to reject any workable peace, a compromise with the Germans. And once they're defeated, they were also pushing for a very humiliating peace. So this is exactly the opposite of what was done.
Well, what you say as well for the audience, it's very important when you make a treaty to respect the possibilities and the safety guarantees of the one who defeats, right? And this went wrong in Versailles and was 20 years later, in fact, the beginning of the Second World War, right?
Exactly.
The fact that Versailles was made in a wrong way, made in fact, was the basis of the Second World War between 39 and 45. This is what you say, right?
Exactly. So Vienna, 1815, we bring the French in, they get a seat at the table. Again, Westphalian system. After the First World War, at the Treaty of Versailles, we do the opposite. Perpetuate the weakness of Germany, just try to knock it out effectively, and this is the source for peace. So then, of course, you're setting yourself up for another war. And again, this is a very much an accepted, become almost common sense. If the Germans hadn't been humiliated and attempted to be kept weak after the First World War, we wouldn't have had a second. So I think this is, again, it shows how the consequences of ignoring the foundation of that Westphalian world order. And it's also worth visiting this difference between Vienna and Versailles if we look, for example, at what happened after the Cold War.
Right. Okay. Then we make another step. The Second World War. We go after the Second World War, 1945, the beginning of the United Nations. Germany, Italy as well, but as well Japan lost the war, and the Allied powers formed the New World Order. How did they do, you think? When you look with your terms to what happened then?
Sorry, how the new...
How did you do? Did you think they did a good job, or they made mistakes in 1945 by constructing the New World Order as we have in the United Nations now?
Well, the good thing with the after World War II is it was established again as a the United Nations is very much based on this principle of Westphalia. That is, you have more than one centers of power. You have many centers of power. It's based on each state then having sovereign equality. So it very much conforms with it. So, but you have after World War II, you have essentially two systems. Under the UN, we still go back to something resembling a Westphalian system. Obviously, the winners of the war got some benefits in terms of the veto powers at the UN Security Councils. And again, some of the idea that we learned the lessons from the First World War by humiliating the Germans, so we brought the Germans instead in. I think this is a bit of a false narrative, to be honest, because the key objective after World War II was, to a large extent, to do something similar. Of course, there were some extreme plans like the Morgenthau plan to really crush Germany, but at the end of it, a key objective for bringing in Germany was because of the alliance systems. That is, they have if you didn't bring Germany in, then there wouldn't be an industrial power capable of balancing the communist, and also without the reindustrializing Germany, the rest of the Europeans would also stand fairly weak. But also another problem is this alliance system. It's not peacetime alliances is not a great recipe for stability. That is, the alliance systems, they tend to perpetuate the need for confrontation. Again, this is something we saw after the Cold War. If the enemy is gone, the big issue then was, well, what about NATO? We need a different mission. We either have to go out of area, out of business. This was our slogan. So this is why peacetime alliances are very problematic. They create incentives or counter alliances. They, again, need this to perpetuate conflict. And this was a key problem during the Cold War. But again, we had like a dual system. You had two separate worlds, the communist, the capitalist, but overarching architecture of the United Nations. I think that conformed well with the Westphalian system.
You know, what you say, we talk about the era now of the Cold War, 1945, 1989, 1991, depends how you want to control it. But what is important that you say as well, that alliances, there were in fact two, NATO and Warsaw Pact, was in fact a big problem. And it is still the problem that NATO is more a problem than a solution. Can I say that?
No, I would agree with that. And I think at this point, at least, the main goal of it was to deter instead. And now it's, I think we see that it's provoking wars instead. But this is something that we discovered already through the Cold War, when there was a recognition that we need to strengthen the common institutions within the world that is bridging the East and the West. Now, we did this to a large extent in 1975 with the Helsinki Accords, but as later on Gorbachev would tell his American partners, a key challenge we have if we want to make peace between the Warsaw Pact and NATO is we also undermine the power foundations. If peace breaks out, these alliances will not necessarily withstand. And this is why also always the Americans were very worried. Even when you had peaceful initiatives from people like Gorbachev, they called it peace offensives, because if they come to us, pretend to be friends and peace, that means the whole alliance structure, the willingness of the Europeans to they will take orders effectively from the Americans, and the need to have alliance solidarity, all of this will be weakened. So in other words, the best thing you can do to destroy an alliance is to take away its common enemy, because this is what an alliance is: country A and B working for collective advantage against country C. So again, this was a key challenge, and I think compromises were made towards the end of the Cold War. But of course, when the Soviet Union collapsed and it was replaced by an increasingly weakened Russia, it removed the whole incentive for making compromise. And instead, I think NATO was then converted into a collective hegemon. So we revived the bloc politics.
Yeah, we're going to the next phase. You mentioned already the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. And then the next phase is, in fact, 1991 to 2014, you can say, right? Which is, in fact, the expansion of NATO.
Can I just point out one more thing during Cold War, because I think it's important. This whole thing with the alliance system, when peace breaks out, why it's so dangerous? Because it's not just in Europe, it was also in Asia. For example, in 1956, when the Soviets and the Japanese attempted to reach a political settlement on the southern Kuril Islands, the Americans got very worried. They even threatened to annex Okinawa if they would make this peace with the Soviets. So you don't want... If you're the dominant state, you don't want your weaker vassals or proxies or weaker allies, let's be kind, to make peace with your adversary, because then the alliance structure falls apart. And anyways, but this has a security dimension. It also has an economic dimension in terms of how value chains are structured. But we don't have to go into all of the details, I guess.
Yeah. Now we have, between 1991 and 2014, we have, as you call it, and a lot of people call it, the unipolar world order, kind of Pax Americana. Well, you can say, I can ask it to you, yeah, but it has a dual aspect as well. I mean, there are two bases. One is, of course, the US, but as well Europe and all the countries in Europe, the EU, the British, of course. You won't see this as a working together in which you can say there is a Western dominated. I mean, you would call it's an American dominated power.
Well, it's I framed it as Pax Americana, much like the British ruled for the century from 1815 to 1914. They call this Britannica. You have after 1991, you have Pax Americana. This simply, refers back to the 200-year period. In Rome when you had no adversaries. Again, it was considered golden era without with any adversaries. Now, just in terms of how this power is distributed. I think the power was definitely concentrated in the United States. But if you're going to have a strategy of global primacy, you also take on other partners. You need nodes in this hegemonic system. So the way the Americans always set up, especially after World War II, they need one on the western periphery of Eurasia, which is why Britain and Western Europe was important. They have on the eastern periphery of Eurasia, which was why Japan became very important. And they always attempted to set up in the south as well, where Israel, Middle East, India. But anyways, you can say that it was to what extent the Europeans were part of it. I think the Europeans, a key reason why the Europeans were quite seduced by the concept of hegemony is because it could as a collective hegemony. That is, the political West consisting of two pillars, more or less equality between the United States and the EU. So it stands on two legs. I think this is was very appealing to the Europeans. I don't think the Americans had cared for it that much, but I think they were willing to entertain it. That is, if a country is a node in the US unipolar system, they usually delegate some privileges to that country. But I don't think at any point they would allow the EU to challenge the dominance of the United States. But as a junior partner to have a collective hegemon, I think, yeah, definitely, I think that existed. And I think the manifestation of that was NATO expansion. That is, yeah, the political West under US leadership essentially asserting collective hegemony over Europe.
Right, right. And then of course, then there is the expansion of NATO, and in fact, then there is a fundamental break in 2014, and then we have the period 2014 to 2022. And then you say, in fact, Ukraine is in fact the tool or the center point of the confrontation between NATO and the Russian Federation. And it became that in 2013, 2014. That's right, right? And how did this happen after 2014?
Well, if you can just say that, just very briefly, I think it's important to also note that after the Cold War, we actually had a Westphalian system emerging, which was what Gorbachev referred to as common European home.
Right.
We actually had, the Charter of Paris for a new Europe. We set up the OSCE. All of this was based on the principle of indivisible security, which is very Westphalian. You have to recognize the opponent. But when we went with NATO expansion, just in context of Ukraine, what it really represents is a rejection of this. It's a hegemonic system, one where NATO would continuously increase its power at the expense of Russia, and Russia would have no seat at the table. It became a new Treaty of Versailles. We would have peace by simply keeping Russia weak. This is what a lot of Americans also explained NATO expansion. Listen, we expand NATO. Yes, Russia will be angry, but they're weak. It doesn't matter. And if we have conflict with them in the future as a result of this, at least we have them surrounded. Now, this is something obviously that annoyed the Russians immensely since the 1990s. And again, many American leaders pointed this out as well. They recognized it. Even Bill Clinton recognized expanding NATO could restart the Cold War. But everyone recognized that Ukraine was different, that, stepping over on Russia's toes, ignoring its security, pursuing zero-sum or pro-bloc politics instead of indivisible security. All of this is something annoyed them. But Ukraine was always known to be a very critical, dangerous red line. This is what, the former ambassador to Russia said, who's now the director of the CIA, William Burns. He called Ukraine the reddest of red lines. So there's no one in Russia you can find who doesn't see this as a extreme violation. And again, this is what Burns also predicted, that if in 2008 he predicted that if NATO would try to get Ukraine onto its side of the ledger, that is to bring Ukraine into its orbit or even NATO membership, that this would most likely trigger a war. He even pointed out this is something the Russians wouldn't want to do, but they would see it as being necessary to do, simply to prevent it, as this would be an existential threat. And also cite Angela Merkel. She even said that the Russians would interpret it as a declaration of war. So everyone kind of knew this already. And yeah, I'm sorry, I might have forgotten your initial question now,
No,
but this is how.
it is. I think it is important to understand, and of course, on this channel, we had a lot of programs and interviews about it, or what were the reasons for the Ukraine war. There's another aspect. Except for the NATO expansion, I want to ask you how's your reaction on the, let's say, the result of the referenda in 2014 in the Donbass. You had in your book attention for the result of the referenda in Crimea, but there were referenda, as you know, in Donbass as well. And I think that's very important because it showed, in fact, that the vast majority of people in Donbass, but even in Zaporizhia and Kherson, which is claimed now by the Russians, is on the side of the Russian Federation. Is that not right? And how do you consider that?
No, of course, it's staged. Well, they established a referendum in 2014. Now, again, just building on what Burns said before, actually, the CIA director actually pointed out two things. It would be first be a civil war, and then Russia would intervene. The reason would be a civil war is because you have millions of ethnic Russians, Russian speakers, but also those who identify with a common history with Russia. So if you refer to the referendum they had in Crimea, you have a Forbes article where they go through all the polls up to 2014, which shows that every single ethnic group, even ethnic Ukrainians in Crimea, voted the majority in favor of joining Russia. So if it's only about the question of territorial integrity versus self-determination, if this is up for democracy, obviously I don't think there's any question at all that the people wanted to join Russia. Now, the counter argument to that would be that it's still a violation of international law. You can't just stage referendums of self-determinations on other people's sovereign borders, and I don't really disagree with that. I mean, there's some arguments that Crimea had certain autonomy, their own parliament, but I haven't really. I still think this is a breach of international law. But again, I think.
I mean, but this is, and you said this in your book as well. It's comparable with the recognition of Kosovo, right? In the Serbian-Kosovo conflict.
Yeah, this is a fascinating. There was some news articles I remember around that when Putin, he actually made this point, like, why you are very, why was Kosovo legit? Why were they allowed to secede, but Crimea is not? And at that point, Obama was making the argument that, well, this was completely different. In Kosovo, you had a referendum with a lot of international observers. It happened according to a lot of transparency, and he made the whole thing up. There was never a referendum in Kosovo. They just snatched it, and so but none of our journalists would say anything. Again, I mentioned this in the book on propaganda because. The thing is, you have two narratives. It's our narrative or the Russian one. So you can't take the side of the Russians. So if our side says something that's obviously false, we can't comment on it because then it's seen as taking the Russian side.
Except the referendum in Crimea, that's very clear. But we have to concentrate on the referenda in what the Russians call the new territories, right? These 4 territories. And in fact, in Donetsk and Luhansk, there were in fact 2 referenda, one in 2014 and one in 2022. And isn't it true? And I'm curious how you judge that the majority, the vast majority, and then you talk about maybe 90% of the population wants to be with the Russian Federation. And that's not only a fact, but it's a very big problem in the legitimation of the war which we make now against the Russian Federation in this area.
Yes, but I would point out that Russia didn't support the referendums in Donbass in 2014 because
Right.
they were afraid that, again, just for context, they saw Crimea as being more of a safe thing. First of all, it was necessary because that's where the Black Sea Fleet was, and they saw that the main reason why the Americans backed the coup in Ukraine is exactly to get Crimea away from the Russians and put it in American hands so they can push Russia into Asia. This was essentially the same objective as during the Crimean War in the mid 19th century. Now, so this was their main objective, and they saw this was possible because the island was, peninsula was transferred. The administrative borders was transferred to Ukraine in 1954 as a part, when they were the same country. So a lot of this was already kind of weak. The Crimeans had their own parliament. It was clearly delineated since a peninsula. What the Russians were worried about in Donbass was if Donbass, they would support a referendum there, then where would you stop? Because the further the Russians go west, the fewer people will greet them with flowers,
Right.
effectively. Once they cross the Dnieper and head towards western Ukraine, they will, not find many Ukrainians who would welcome them anymore. So at some point you have to stop, and wherever you don't stop, you're going to cut off a lot of, maybe millions of ethnic Russians as well. So it would make a big mess out of it, and also it would make NATO countries, especially the Europeans, feel very insecure. So it was better for the Russians just to say, listen, you topple the government, we take back Crimea because this is a strategic base for us. Let's call it quits and make a peace. And that's why they also agreed
Yeah.
and pushed the
Well,
Minsk agreement.
yeah, but still the question, because of course then Minsk was built, but Minsk failed. But still, on the moment the war is going on, from 22, it's now 25. We hope for a peace settlement the coming months, one of the coming months. But still, the question is, where will be the new border? And where do you think will be the natural border when you say that people have self-determination, these areas have self-determination and could choose free? What do you think these people and these areas will choose?
Well, it all depends. If it was 2014, I think they would have Russia would have maybe a better chance of winning over much of the population, but they've alienated a huge part of the Ukrainian population as well with this war. On the other hand, there's a lot of Ukrainians who are not too happy with the Zelensky government either, given what he has done against Russian speakers as well. So it's hard to say, but I think it wouldn't. I think it would where the borders are drawn. I think depends on where the security or what kind of security agreement we might be able to reach. I tend to be a bit pessimistic. Now, what I'm saying is, I think the Russians will be willing to effectively stop. They said, they want this for oblast, which they have annexed. That is Lugansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye. Now, they don't actually control all of these areas, so they might be even willing to do some land swaps and make concession where the administrative border goes. Again, no one's telling me from Kremlin, so I don't know, but this is possible. But my point is, if there's no deal and the NATO, as again Stoltenberg kept saying throughout the war, once the war is over, Ukraine gonna join NATO. What we're saying is that historical Russian cities such as Odessa will now become NATO territory. It will be NATO warships, docking there. It will be, most likely language laws, respect for Russian culture, the Orthodox Church. All of this will be trampled upon. So this is going to be too humiliating for Russia, not just culturally, but also strategically. They can't afford to have NATO in Odessa. So my point is simply this: if they have the option between of a city like Odessa being in the hands of NATO or Russia, then they will annex it, no question asked. But if it's a possibility of restoring Ukraine's neutrality and the basic human rights for Russian speakers there, then I think they would be willing to let Odessa be a part of a neutral Ukraine. So I don't think anything is set yet. But this is why I'm saying what NATO is saying is so dangerous. threatening to expand NATO after the war, all you're telling the Russians is whatever you don't take now is going to belong to us and it can be used against you. It's so I guess it all depends.
Would you say, especially what I said as well in different programs, that it should be the best for the future of Europe, of Russia, and especially for these areas that Ukraine, Moldavia, and Georgia would be neutral?
Definitely. I think that's completely unnecessary. And I think that's one of the big falsehoods we said is, oh, Ukraine must have the right to join a military bloc. This is, first of all, it's wrong on two levels. One, it suggests that NATO simply wants to help the right of Ukrainians to choose what they want. But keep in mind, between 91 and 2014, barely 20% of Ukrainians wanted to join NATO. We pushed very hard to pull them into NATO. We topple their government. So this is not to help Ukraine. This is to expand NATO. And the second is there's never been such a principle ever before. Countries like Mexico, they have the freedom to, have economic ties and political ties with any country they want. But Mexico doesn't have the freedom to host Russian and Chinese military bases. If they would do this, America would bomb that country to bits before they would ever permit this to happen. So it's quite absurd. And again, it should be common sense. I think in the West now we have this propaganda where we say, well, if you try to explain what Russia will do, then you're legitimizing it. So, now you have to be canceled. So it's a very absurd logic, but it's, again, what I've been arguing since 2013, if we try to pull Ukraine into NATO, Russia will destroy it because it's a threat to its existence. It's just the reality of what they will do. Ignoring that reality, I think, is the most immoral thing we can do because then, we see what's happened now. And this is also why I said all the way through the war from 2014, if we really care about the Ukrainians, for God's sake, recognize their neutrality. If we do otherwise, Russia will take the territory and it will destroy what's left to make sure it can't be used against Russia. I mean, this should be common sense. And I think the Georgians, as you mentioned, they realize this. These days we present the new Georgian government, not new, but the current Georgian government as being pro-Putin and anti-West. Nothing could be further from the truth. They still want to join the EU. They consider themselves pro-European, but they don't. But they realize that they're living on the Russian border. If you start to host hostile forces and put in American missile systems, they're going to be destroyed. The Russians will crush them. And so you have to respect the neighborhood you live in. And I think, again, it's quite reasonable. And just as a final note, I think we tend to portray this as, well, now we're giving Russia a sphere of influence, which suggests exclusive influence. But in 2008 and onwards, the Russians actually called for a different concept, which was sphere of interest, not influence. Now, a sphere of interest is different. It's not, you don't demand exclusive influence, but what you say is when you're operating on our borders, you have to take our security into concern. Again, a very Westphalian thing to do. Same as if Russia is in Mexico, you have to take America into concern, their security into concern. It's common sense. We haven't really approached this in a sensible way, I think. And if we approach it in a sensible way, it's not like we're doing favors for the Russians. We're doing a favor for ourselves. Because if we don't threaten the Russian security, then they won't do what they have done now, which definitely undermines our security.
Yes, and the final aspect, it's a bit of positive thing. You started already. It's the Eurasian Westphalian order, right? When we take a more positive stand on this, what would you advise and how would this Eurasian Westphalian order look like?
Well, it's a system. Again, I relate it a bit back to Macinder's idea about how maritime powers are more have a greater proclivity towards hegemony. But anyways, the main idea is that this is not one hegemon. There's many centers of power. So again, if you go back to the ancient Silk Road, it's very scattered. It's not concentrated as it would be under a maritime power. And it's not just many centers of power, but it's also based on civilizational distinctiveness. That is, you reject universalism. And I always make the point that this is something we should be very happy at when we see China, because you would think if a power grows as powerful as China, it's reason to be worried if they're going to start to claim their right to represent other people. But they actually have this global civilizational initiative, and they keep insisting that no one civilization can tell another one how to develop. Now, this is good news, I think, because if we fear China becoming dominant, the worst thing you want to see is them pursuing an ideology such as liberal democracy, where they can, not that there's something wrong with liberalism, but where they say that this is a universal value, we are the best at it, we represent it, now we have the right to impose it on others. This would be a nightmare, coupled with hegemonic power, and they would then embrace these universal principles, which legitimizes them intruding in the sovereignty of other states. I think then we would be in deep trouble. But you don't actually see it, and I think that's yeah, a positive aspect as well. And again, it could create a more stable international system as well, I think. And this has been one of my criticism as well of all these sanctions we're doing, because I think across Eurasia, a natural balance of power would emerge. Now we're very worried that the Russians are too dependent on China. Well, the Russians are worried too. They don't want to be too dependent on China. They want to diversify, so don't become excessively dependent on one country, because then it could form into a more dominant position. That's why they're diversifying. They want to connect closer with Iran, India, the Europeans, Korea. They want to connect with everyone, Africa, and this is good. But what we're doing is we're trying to sever Europe from Russia. What happens then? Russia leans further towards China. See now the cut following destruction of Nord Stream. All the gas now goes to China. The Russians are building gas pipelines to Iran. This is not what we wanted. We want a natural balance of power to emerge, not confrontational and militaristic, but prevent this concentration of power.
Okay, very last question. You think there will be a peace treaty the coming months or not? With Trump now in power and he promised us this?
I think I'm a bit critical. I think it depends a bit what happens on the battlefield as well, and also how Trump plays this. I think that the main problem is we could have had a peace in beginning of 2022. I mean, only today I noticed that the former advisor of Zelensky, Arestovich, he was tweeting out that our Western partners didn't let us make peace in March of 2022, and now they still want to continue the war. And I think this is the main problem. Back in 2022 at Istanbul, there was a peace agreement. It was ready to be signed between the Ukrainians and the Russians. The deal was very simple. Russia pulls back its military forces to where it had been before the invasion, and in return, Ukraine would accept restoring its neutrality. The Americans and British sabotaged this to have a long war against Russia. Now, of course, 3 years later, there's two consequences. The Russians will not trust NATO anymore. They will always suspect that we will try to revive a long war later on. Indeed, you see European leaders saying this, oh, let's just have a ceasefire. We can rebuild Ukraine and remilitarize it. So they don't want this. They don't want a ceasefire. I think that's a non-starter. They want a political solution or nothing. And the political solution has to be restoring neutrality of Ukraine. So what was achieved in Istanbul, plus the territorial concessions. That is, Russia now says there's a territorial dispute since the Russians annexed four oblasts, by the way, that's where it comes from. But nonetheless, they want this to be ceded. Now, if I think the Russians, again, I think there's room for maneuver. At least my instinct is when I go to Moscow and all, I get the impression that they might be prepared to change administrative borders. But again, I don't have any evidence for this, but something might be able to be done. But the territory they're holding now, at least, they're not giving up. And because, again, there's no trust. When Trump is gone, the new American administration can come and they say, well, we're back at NATO expansion. And no, so these territories are now in the hands of Russia. Now, if they can achieve these two things, neutrality and find some compromise on the territories, which is like 20% of Ukrainian land, then of course I think the Russians would want a peace with the Europeans. Ideally, they would want a new European security architecture, though, something to replace the zero-sum bloc politics. Ideally, revive something Westphalian. But short of this, I mean, it's a big demand from the Russians. You know, the Ukrainians lost hundreds of thousands of men, which are now dead. They lost 20% of their territory. They will have no security guarantees at all from NATO. It's a very difficult thing to sell, even if Trump wants this. How is he going to sell it to the American political system? I mean, he's not king. He has to get some support. So it's going to be very difficult. And at the same time, the Europeans seem to be doing everything they can to sabotage even negotiations with the Russians, and Zelensky doesn't want to do anything. So if this is the case, I just think the Russians will go for victory and take whatever they want or need. And this is something I think is bad for Russia, because I don't think an excessive victory is good. I think it's horrible for Ukraine. It will destroy their nation. And indeed, if Russia has to feel safe by taking, for example, Odessa, I think it would undermine European security as well. So I hope, of course, that there will be some negotiations and political settlements.
Okay, Glenn Diesen, very grateful for the interview. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Sorry for the long answers.